Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your time and dedication in learning something new. Today, we will be talking about how we can help the hard of hearing community. And this is me. Hello, prevention educator Ruth Del Pino. Once again, if you are new to this, thank you for being here. But also know that we have a chat feature on here. So in case you have any reactions or questions, you can put that in the chat. So I always start off with who I am, just in case, so we understand where I'm coming from when we're doing these sorts of things. Hello, my name is Ruth Del Pino. I'm a prevention educator and program coordinator at the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I am the Mercer County Grant Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified in teaching English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. So that is the basis for most of what I interact with and what I do. Why this presentation? I also always start my presentations with this, just so we sort of kickstart what the basic understanding is. So one, this is not to scare you. Two, this is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they've known themselves. I also want to say that this is not a parenting class. This is for anyone that works with youth or anyone that is curious about a topic that they may not have known otherwise. Also, my perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences. So anything that I learn, let's say at a conference, at a specific sort of teaching moment, those are the things that I bring back with me. Also know that this is evidence informed and some evidence based. And what I mean by that is I take all the evidence I can find, all the research that I've done on this topic. I put this into the presentation and I list the resources at the end so that if you're looking at on the YouTube channel, then you can look through the presentation with me as we go through these resources. And just to know that the evidence-based parts are pulled from the different organizations and the different programs that we have at the Mercer Council. So that includes Too Good for Drugs, Footprints, Life Skills, Too Good for Drugs and Violence, Parents Who Host, things like that. Those are all the sorts of programs that I teach, but there are a plethora of programs that we have available at the Mercer Council, which you can find on our website at mercercouncil.org. So here we're going in. I want to start with sort of the baseline of the definitions that we're going to be discussing today, because there's a lot of stuff going around, right? So there are so many different preferred ways that people want to identify, and we just have to look at that and hopefully honor that to the best of our ability. But we sort of want to look at some things first. Now, I don't have this in order on the way that it's written down, so we're going to be jumping around just a little bit, but let's hope that you're paying attention, which will be nice to listen to in the back. So the first thing is that the term deaf usually refers to hearing loss so severe that it's very little or something that requires a 100% hearing loss. And what we're sort of looking at this is that hearing loss in general actually has a spectrum. So much like any other condition and much like anything else that exists in humans, there is a spectrum. So there can be severe hearing loss, there can be moderate hearing loss. People can sort of modify their hearing loss and supplement it and mitigate it through different procedures. So there are a lot of different ways that people can do that. So the overarching term is usually hard of hearing, and this is usually the most politically correct term that people can use. Deaf is usually something that people use in general when they have 100% hearing loss, and deafened is an adult term that means that people who have had hearing loss and eventually are deaf by adulthood. So this is actually an adult term. So when you say a deafened person, that usually means that they had hearing loss later on in their lives. So I also want to talk a little bit about impaired hearing and hearing impaired. I didn't really know this for a long time. I actually used the term hearing or hearing impaired or impaired hearing because I thought that that was the best way to just, not say anything that could hurt anyone's feelings or that could, sort of holistically define what that person was going through. But the research and a lot of what I've been taught is that it's not preferred. And there are a couple of different reasons why. One thing is that it implies a deficit. but deficit meaning that there is something wrong with the person, wrong with the whole person. So when something is impaired, that usually means that there's something wrong with it or wrong with that person. And we don't want to have that sort of conversation. So when we're moving forward, we're going to be using a lot of different language, but we will not be using hearing impaired. Can be used hard of hearing, deafened, those sorts of things, just so that we can understand what the language would be and the vocabulary moving forward. Also, there are a lot of people that have a lot of different feelings on the word disability, and I think that there are many different communities that have a lot of different things to say about this. And especially in my presentation with autism and substance use disorders, what I had found and what has been taught to me and what many people in the community of autism have sort of taught me is that it really does depend on the person, whether it's person first language or identity first language. It doesn't really matter to us. It matters to the person. So we should ask the person first, see what they prefer, and then move along from there. So some people say that using the word disability gets people what they need. The way that our system is built is that it really does talk about, especially when you look at a lot of programs and litigious information, it talks about disabilities. It talks about people who have disabilities. So when we are using the word disability, think of it most of the time, has it been how it's been explained to me, and especially people in the hard of hearing community say that disability is a word that gets people to places they need to be, to the resources and programs they need to be a part of. So that doesn't mean that we get to use it all the time. That doesn't mean that we have free reign on using that, but asking a person what they feel most comfortable with is probably the best way to go in terms of that. So we're sort of going to get that out of the way. This is the basis for basically everything that we're doing, and we will be going on from there. Now, ableism. This is definitely something that needs to be talked about because there are a lot of different ways that we can talk about ableism. And I have a really good definition that I had said in my autism and substance use disorders presentation, and I'm going to sort of surmise it here. And basically what it says and what the implication is that ableism is the belief and the system that able-bodied people without chronic illness, without a disability, without anything that impairs their everyday life, they think that they are above people or they are superior in some way. And it also that we need to understand is that ableism implies a system. So when we have a system of things, that system in itself exists. And that is something that needs to be rewritten and needs to be revised. So when we talk about things that are systems, the implication is that this system exists. And it exists in a way that even if there were no ableist people within that system, even if there were no people that were discriminatory in that system, the system would still be ableist. The system would still be discriminatory because the way that the policies are written, the litigiousness, the legality of the circumstances, all of those sorts of things tend to be ableist. So let's understand that ableism definitely is an individual thing. It's person to person, but it also exists on a grander scale. And that is something that we're going to see throughout this presentation, that it may not be people, it may not be a person to person, but it is the way that the people interact with their environment, with the people around them, and with the services they're trying to have for their own well-being. Now, there are different forms of ableism. I want to make that clear as well. Some different forms can include the anti-vax movement, where people say that vaccines can cause autism. That in itself is an ableist thought. There are different sorts of ableism that exist here, but today we're going to be talking about audism. And what I mean by audism is AUDISM. I'm not saying it wrong. That's how it's actually supposed to be said. Audism is the belief that people who are hard of hearing do not navigate the world the same way that people who are able-bodied are. And what I mean by that full hearing people is that full hearing people believe that people who are hard of hearing are not fully capable of doing the things that they are capable of. And what this presentation will show you is that obviously that's not true, but there are a lot of different ways that we have autism, even internalized autism for people who are hard of hearing, but also autism in fully hearing people as well. So there is actually a great presentation that I actually came across. This person actually does have, I don't know the level of hearing that this person has, but they did talk a lot about their experiences with ableism, with deaf culture, and with autism. So I just wanted to have this person take the floor because this is something that I don't have an experience with, but this person does.
My story I will tell today is about my journey into the deaf community and how I've adapted to deaf culture, autism, and ableism. There are two types of deaf that people in the deaf community typically refer to, uppercase D and lowercase d. In short, the biggest distinction between the two is that uppercase D deaf people normally use American Sign Language at all times, whereas lowercase d deaf people is more of an umbrella term to describe profound hearing loss. In general, deafness comes in many forms. In my case, I would identify as oral deaf, since I am able to speak but cannot hear. This form of deafness is considered a privilege, especially when you have no deaf accent. The deaf community overall is very rich with deaf culture. Culture is defined as the beliefs, customs, arts, etc. of a particular society, group, place, or time. These ideals are very prevalent in the deaf community, whether it be art, traditions, or ASL poetry. People often forget how large the deaf community is. American Sign Language is the third most used non-English language in the United States, yet people are so unaware of deaf issues, ableism, and autism. In short, ableism is defined as discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. We live in a world that is designed around being able to hear. Because of this, deaf people rapidly fall behind in social status, jobs, and education. For example, 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. A large majority of these parents still use speaking as the primary form of communication, with very few attempting to learn American Sign Language. This causes the children to suffer deficiencies in the English language, with the average deaf high school graduate having the reading level of a 4th grader. Meanwhile, autism is the notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear. It means that life without hearing is futile and miserable, and from that a negative stigma is created towards anyone who does not hear. Just in my short amount of time of being deaf, I have experienced countless moments of ableism and autism, and one particular that stands out to me was when I was seeing an ear specialist in New York. I asked if they had an ASL or CAR personnel who could assist me. They said they would not provide one for me and that it would cost me up to $85 per hour to call and get one. This was significantly more expensive than getting a translator for other languages such as Spanish or French. I got particularly frustrated because it's not like I wanted to be deaf. It's not like I would be able to just pick up hearing. It is also ironic that an office that is designed to assist deaf patients cannot provide a service for these deaf patients to even understand what is going on. Ableism and autism are both forms of oppression in our society. Similar to what Freire says in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it is possible to overcome this oppression through a mutual process between the oppressor and the oppressed. Therefore, awareness is key when trying to fight ableism and autism, since many people are unaware of these issues. Niall DeMarco, an actor, model, and activist, is one of the first deaf TV celebrities. He constantly tries to fight autism and ableism. He dedicates a majority of his time to fight reading deficiencies and make the hearing world a more comfortable and friendly place for deaf people. To end, I will show an example clip.
So there we go. I think that that video shows a lot of different ways that people can sort of adapt and understand where the faults in our system lie, but also to sort of make a point that that when we're talking about ability and resources, understand that if we are not giving resources to people that need them, they are not given the resources to thrive. They are not given the resources to make sure that they have a fulfilling life. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. This could be due to the ableist system. This could be due to an ableist person, but understanding that a system is written against people who are in the minority in general. And to also understand that just because one part is not being provided for, that any other part should be taken away from, but to work on this part right now. Meaning that if we have Spanish and French and German translators, then obviously we should have ASL translators. And that's something that I think can be thought of more. The absence of something is still the ism of it, the system in which takes away from that person's experience. So understanding that just because it's not included, that's the exact reason why it's an ableist system in the first place. So I understand also that there are a lot of different ways that we can navigate ableism, but there is a great resource on deaf culture and understanding the word deaf and disabled and things like that, and is by Very Well Health. And I actually use them a lot in my resources, but for us to understand that the word disabled has a lot of different connotations to it. And if you want, you can read that article. It is a very well thought out article, but there are a lot of different reasons why this person says, yes, disabled is not the preferred term, but it is something that gets us where we need to go, and the resources are given to us in that way. And it's really a thought on this. These people are playing the ableist system for them to get their needs met, but that doesn't mean that that is the word that should be preferably used. So there are a lot of different thoughts on that, but I just want to make that clear that disabled is the term that people use, but it also is a term that plays into the ableist system rather than something that is in spite of it. So some people are just using it and owning it to get what they need. So here we go. Next slide. Okay, so there are a lot of different, I know I have two videos back to back. Didn't necessarily mean for it to happen that way, but there are so many different ways that we are sort of looking at hearing and hard of hearing. So there are quite a few resources that I wanted to share, and also understanding that there is a culture around social media when it comes to people who are hard of hearing and deaf. And there are a lot of different reasons for that, but one is social media is very visual, and people who are hard of hearing and deaf need that visual representation, because there are a lot of different ways that people can feel enlightened, that people can feel affirmed, and social media is just one of them. This is a great resource. It's hearinglikeme.com, and it is meant for hard of hearing people and deaf people. And what they say is, here are these some deaf TikTokers that are worth following, and it makes a huge list of people who make content, do ASL as well as subtitled and captioned information, which I think is lovely. TikTok isn't loading here, but there are a lot of different resources and people that educate their community on their experiences and on the deaf community experience. So I think that was great. And I think that it is a testament that there are modern ways for people to educate themselves and for people to understand what that looks like. I also want to talk about the hashtag deaf itself. So there on TikTok, there is a hashtag and people can use it for a lot of different things, but people can either use hard of hearing, deaf, hearing loss, things like that. But for this, when I checked, I believe it was yesterday, 3.6 billion views were on this hashtag, specifically on TikTok. So yeah, that was yesterday too. But look at how many views that is, and look at how many videos people have. They're using ASL. They are using, the different experiences for people to understand that there is not one way to be deaf. There is not one way to have hearing loss. And this is all really important because they come from all walks of life. There are people who are LGBTQIA and deaf. There are people who have other forms of other forms of experiences, and they all talk about them. So I think that is truly exciting for us to understand. And that is just with the hashtag deaf, and deaf is something that is an English word. So you can imagine what people around the world are, what kind of content they're getting into as well. So lots of different ways. They also have a lot of ASL TikToks where you can actually learn American Sign Language with people that are teaching it. So I think that is really cool too. All right, so here we go. And I sort of want to talk about some experiences that people who are deaf or identify as deaf or have hearing loss or are hard of hearing understand that they may work really hard to function as a person who like seems as if they are not do not have hearing loss, but there are ways in which people navigate the world. They make sure that these they are very proficient at certain things, and sometimes it can actually hurt them more than help them. And this is interesting, and I just wanted to put this out there because this particular YouTuber has many identities. She is someone who does vintage clothing. She is someone who identifies as part of the LGBTQIA community. She is someone who is an advocate. She is someone who has written books. She's very successful in her life. She's also a mother. There are many different ways that people can identify, but also understanding that people who thrive and flourish and also happen to be hard of hearing or deaf still have challenges when they present as someone who does not have hearing loss at all. So we're going to sort of touch upon that topic as well. And also, I put this under social media for a number of reasons, but understand there are so many YouTube videos on people who are deaf and hard of hearing and sort of how to help them, but also understand that education is the most important part of all of this, that if we educate ourselves, if we understand the experiences of others, then we are able to fully give them resources in the way that doesn't hurt them and that helps them. Okay.
Really, the easiest way for me to remember how to make sounds. Having a voice that does not sound deaf can be a negative, in that much like I think the word disabled is a great thing because that is a label that helps me. It gets me the things that I need in order to live life as a disabled person. Having a voice that does not sound deaf is a problem in that it makes people think I can hear, which I can't. So when I meet people for the first time, they generally have no idea that I am deaf. They'll just chat to me, or they lean in. Oh, they lean in. And that's always awkward because they lean in to talk in my ear and I push them back so I can lip read, but also I've pushed them back and then I've stared at their lips, so they're kind of assuming, oh my god, did that girl think I was going in for a kiss? I was not going in to kiss her. This is really weird. This is very awkward. Do I say something that sounds like, oh my god, I wasn't going to kiss you? No, wait, does she think? Does she know? Does she know I know? Does she know I know she knows? Oh my god. Also, having a voice that does not sound deaf is not a helpful thing on the internet. Hi, internet. Because people write a lot that I don't sound deaf and it makes them believe that I am not deaf, though why someone would fake being deaf, I have yet to know. As I've said in my other videos this week, deafness is not one thing. There is not a set way to be deaf. It does not mean that you are 100% hearing loss, you can't hear a thing, you were brought up with deaf parents, you went to a deaf school, you've never talked to hearing people before and you only use sign language and you never use a voice. That's not deafness. That is a type of deafness. That is a person who is deaf and is living their life doing their thing. You can also have been born deaf, gone to a mainstream school, used your voice, lip read, and then get older and be like, god damn it, I wish I could sign. You could also be born hearing, lose your hearing, then your schools say, we can't help you learn sign language, now deaf kid, but we can provide you with a sign language interpreter. So helpful. So I've never actually had sign language classes. No. I just taught myself using the internet and books. And watching my sign language interpreter that my school and the local council were happy to provide, but not classes. That was a sticky few months / year of confusion. Also, my sign language.
Okay, so she sort of goes on to talk about the many different forms of sign language people can have. I will be talking about that later in the presentation, so I don't want to get into that right now. But as you can see, sort of understanding that just because people present themselves a certain way, just because people are really good at excelling beyond what their experiences are, and in spite of their experiences and with their experiences, that doesn't mean that we cannot provide resources to people that need them. Even if people are flourishing, there are still different areas that we can say, this is where this needs to take place. This is where we can help them and move on from there. I think there are a lot of different ways we can do that, but we'll be touching upon that later on. All right, it's going to start again. Yes, it will start again. Okay, so here we go. Ooh, my apologies. It's always tricky with those YouTubes. So I sort of had this presentation or this slide in particular in my autism and substance use disorders presentation. And I put this in there for a lot of different reasons. And when we're sort of looking at ableism, I will be talking about that again, just so we can understand the context, because I thought it would be best to put it after an experience that people have in their lives and understanding the resources that are given to them. So one in particular ableist statement that a person with autism had sort of explained to me was that a lot of the time people with autism have trouble with eye contact. And when they say, look at the person when you're speaking with them, that is technically an ableist statement, because that doesn't mean that everyone communicates that way. That's an implication that if you're not looking at the person, you're not good at communication. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the case. So there are a lot of different reasons why it's important to acknowledge this, but also to understand that there are so many people in the world that identify with a sort of disability, whatever that looks like. And there are so many deaf people in the United States. I have quite a few different numbers, but they're not necessarily conclusive, but 15% of the population identifies with some type of disability, meaning that in the United States, 15% of the people that we interact with on an everyday basis have the likelihood of having something akin to a disability or labeled as a disability on a litigious sense. So this is something that we need to address, because that is enough of a population for us to understand that these people need help, that these people need resources, and if we can make their lives easier, then so be it, right? So there are a lot of different ways that we can sort of talk about blatant ableism, everyday ableism, and a microaggression. So there can be blatant ways of ableism, segregating students with disabilities into separate schools, the use of restraints or seclusion in means of controlling students with disabilities, segregating adults and children with disabilities in institutions, failing to incorporate accessibility into design plans, so such as someone who may not be able to read signs that may have Braille on them, building inaccessible websites, the assumption that people with disabilities want or need to be fixed, refusing to provide reasonable accommodations, eugenics movement of the early 1900s, the anti-vaxxer movements of the early 2000s, the mass murder of disabled people in Nazi Germany. Obviously, those things are pretty blatant, right? So when we're sort of looking at everyday ableism, there are a lot of different ways we can look at that too. So one of them can be choosing an inaccessible venue for, let's say, someone who is hard of hearing or may not have an accommodation right away, and excluding some participants in a group. Also not having subtitles on videos. That is another way that can be ableist. Also framing disability as either tragic or inspirational in news stories, movies, and other popular forms of media. I know that there are a lot of jokes that people who joke about saying, oh, I'm inspirational because I'm in a wheelchair, you know. That means that that identity is not that whole person, and that person gets to decide what that identity looks like for them. And they're not inspirational for existing. People are not inspirational for their existence. People are inspirational with what they do, with what they have. So that can be another way. Also, casting a non-disabled actor to play a disabled character in a play, movie, TV show, or commercial, making a movie that doesn't have auto description or closed captioning, wearing scented products in a scent-free environment. That was something new to me. Talking to a person with a disability like a child, talking about them instead of directly to them or speaking for them. That is something that I do see a lot. So there are a lot of different ways we can do that. Also, understanding that positions and reading lips are really important too. As we had in the last video, positions meaning that where that person is presently placed. So if someone who is hard of hearing wants to read your lips or needs to read your lips, then making sure that you are in a line of vision where they can do that, that's important. There are a lot of different ways to do that. I know that when I was about 21 years old, I had a partner who was a work partner who we were sort of working this summer together. And when she needed something, I would have to go in front of her, say what I needed, and then she would sort of go from there because she was hard of hearing. But she had cochlear implants as well. So there were a lot of different ways that we could have communicated, but reading lips was the easiest for her. So I decided that, whenever we were going to talk, I was just going to stand in front of her and to make sure that she could read my lips. And that was something that was very easy for both of us to sort of accommodate. And understand that because people say they're hard of hearing, go with what their communication is best for, because otherwise you won't get your point across. There will be no communication. And if there is a small modification on the way that you communicate, then that's okay, because that's not necessarily inconvenient for anyone. Also, understand that employment is affected by the systems we have in place. And this is where I'm sort of going to get into this is why we need to address these things first, because these numbers are a little bit disturbing, kind of staggering for a lot of different reasons. But also understand that only 53.3% of deaf people, and once again, I'm going to be reading this, so I'm going to be throwing numbers out there is what I'm warning you about. So the National Deaf Center sort of did a lot of different reports, and they did something up to the year of 2017, and only 53.3% of deaf people ages 25 to 64 were employed, compared to 75.8% of hearing people. That is a gap of 22.5%. That means that 22.5% of people that are hard of hearing or in the deaf community do not have a job, do not have the resources to gain a job, or are unable to hold employment due to maybe ableist policies. Now, employment rates have not increased from 2008 to 2017 for deaf Americans, and a population that deaf Americans have not yet recovered since the recession in 2008. So that's 12 years. Or at that point, that would have been 11 years in 2017. Is my math right? No, 9 years. My apologies. Deaf people are underrepresented in key growth sectors in the economy, such as healthcare. Employment and wage gaps get larger when factors such as race, ethnicity, gender, and disability are considered. So understand that this is just talking about the general population of hearing loss, but also know that people of color and different populations that are underrepresented, historically oppressed, all have different disparities when it comes to that. So being someone who is a person of color, even particularly Black or African American, and being deaf or hard of hearing can be much harder than someone who is white and hard of hearing or deaf. Also understand that significantly, a whopping 42.9% of deaf people have opted out of the labor force, more than double the rate of hearing people. So that is 20.8%. Also understand that there are a lot of different ways that we can sort of interpret and people internalize the ableism that they experience. And there was some new research done by the University of Michigan, and we're going to be talking about substance use disorders and the age of hearing loss study that was done. And the VA, who was sort of a part of the healthcare system, had done quite a few different studies, but the preliminary results were very striking. According to the research, Americans under the age of 25 with diagnosed hearing loss were up to 2.5 times more likely to have a substance abuse problem with prescription drugs compared to the regular hearing people. Moreover, adults between the age of 35 to 49 were twice as likely as normal hearing people to abuse prescription drugs. Now, this was a very specific study. This does not talk about alcoholism. This does not talk about marijuana use disorder. This does not talk about opioids in any sense. But what it does show us is that hearing loss is something that can inspire substance use disorder. Coming to terms with something that you may be losing, especially this is with people who have hearing loss. This is not necessarily with people who were born with hearing loss or were born deaf, but these are people that did lose their hearing through time. And this is concerning for a lot of reasons, because the sort of feelings that they go through may be very different than the feelings who people who are born deaf go through. But once again, understanding these experiences are not necessarily something that we can ignore, because this shows that there is a disparity, that there is a need, that there is a gap in the resources that people are receiving, so that we can sort of mitigate some of those substance use disorders. I also have a quote here, and it says, "For people without disabilities, technology makes things easier. For people with disabilities, it makes things possible." And I sort of want to touch upon this just for a second, because when people talk about technology, when people talk about people being reliant on technology, understand that a lot of the time, especially in the, made for TV sort of goofy ways that people, grapple with everyday tasks. For example, there are people that may not be able to open jars, and you're like, well, if you acted less silly, maybe you could open up the jar, especially on those infomercials. But understanding that um, sorts of uh, those sorts of commercials and infomercials are actually made for people with disabilities. Those are made for people that, it supplements their lives, it supplements an action that other people could do, but it makes things possible. It makes things easier for them. And I think that what we need to also understand is that technology in its own right, and being attached to it or being enthralled by it, is not necessarily a bad thing, in that people who have disabilities, people who have hearing loss, people who have any sort of a disability, can use technology to make their lives possible, to make their lives better in the way that they interact with the world. And it sort of fills in the gaps of the resources they may not be receiving. So also understand that that's part of the process too. So there are a lot of different ways you can access sign language, and I thought that was really interesting. Starbucks is actually one of the best known companies that talks or that does ASL, American Sign Language. There were several Starbucks that have opened up signing stores, and if you click here, you can find the different signing stores in the United States. And I think that's pretty cool. That you can sort of look through. And if you see this on the person's apron, that means they do ASL. Most Starbucks baristas are actually trained in basic ASL, just because that is something that people may have trouble with, right? So Starbucks is a great place for that. And for people who may may struggle with any other way to order, that is a great way to do that. Also, they have quite a few different accommodations, so it's not just someone signing. When people are ordering at the window, for example, they can actually have cameras that you can sign back and forth with. So I think that's really cool, and I think that this could be a model for different multinational corporations and corporations in general to accommodate ASL, and to accommodate hard of hearing people that use ASL. There are also different ways that people, especially this, it's csdirectory.com, but what they actually found was that basic ASL is being taught more in companies, especially because they may have hard of hearing or deaf clients. So there are some basic helpful ASL phrases in case you ever wanted to interact with a hard of hearing person and practice your ASL. Also understand that there are a lot of different ways that people who are deaf and hard of hearing can interact with their environment. And unemployed and deaf people are taking matters into their own hands by teaching ASL to other people, by letting them know the struggles that they may face with ASL. So I think that's also a great resource as well. It's by NPR, so I think it's pretty reputable. So I think that is also a good resource to look at. Now, understand that we're sort of going to be looking at deaf culture for a second, and deaf culture is interesting in a lot of different ways, because communication does look different. That's kind of the basis for the ASL, for the deaf culture that exists in the United States. But also understand that when we're talking about sign language does not exist the same way in every country. And this is something that many people may not necessarily think about. It is something that would make sense, but it's not necessarily something people think about, that each country and portions of the United States have their own culture, which means each country has their own different way of signing, their own different way of expressing, their own different way of communicating. So ASL would obviously look different from British Sign Language, would obviously look different from Thai Sign Language. Just a quick story, when I had lived abroad in Thailand for a year, and next door they had a water factory where they employed mostly hard of hearing and deaf people, because the sounds of the water factory were so loud that most people would have to wear earphones or earplugs, but people who were deaf or hard of hearing didn't necessarily have the same problems. So they employed them because they thought, one, you'd be saving on cost, but two, it provides jobs to these people. So I actually came to interact with a lot of people who use Thai Sign Language, and I actually learned some Thai signs while I was there. And what you really understand is that when people are talking about sign language, there are different ways that people can do it, right? And there are a lot of different areas that people can sort of integrate their culture into their sign language. So it's not just a standard sign language. It's talking about the many different ways that people have hand motions. People can create their own language with their hands. So there are a lot of different ways to do that. Also, understanding that facial expressions are a really big part of sign language as well. So when you're saying, oh, I'm angry, your face needs to look more angry. If you're upset, your face needs to it may feel like you're exaggerating, but also to understand that some people, especially in this day and age, when people said they were on Zoom, when you're on Zoom, I don't know about anybody else, but whenever I'm on Zoom, I make faces very loudly. Especially when it is something that I'm either upset about, shocked about, interested to learn. I look at my face and I actually wonder how expressive my face really is. So in deaf culture, the facial expressions are very, very big and very large. Also, the structure of the language is different. So what's important is, first, it does subject, verb, object, boy, throw, ball. Spoken English, the boy throws the ball. And there are different ways as well. So there's SSE, which is sentence supported, sentence supported English, or sign supported English, my bad. So when you do that, you do signs that supplement things that you may not be able to say or that are unclear, so that people can sort of fill in the gaps with your language. And American Sign Language is actually with the structure of subject, verb, object, but SSE is spoken along with spoken English, or used along spoken English. Also, understand that deaf culture maintains certain protocols, certain rules, certain things that are socially acceptable. In hearing culture, a restaurant waiter may never touch a diner, but actually in deaf culture, the waiter touching the diner does help, because it talks about the different, because it helps with the interaction to get that person's attention, right? Similarly, it's okay for deaf persons to maintain a steady gaze when they're signing to each other. Well, sometimes in hearing interactions, it can be different when they're interacting. Especially because it can sort of feel a little bit intense with the eye contact. But also, I thought this article was really interesting because it talks about the cognitive dissonance and the duality of people that navigate a hearing world and also navigate a non-hearing world and a hard of hearing and deaf world. So understand that this article is great. It's interesting. It's really intriguing because it talks about the difficulty between maintaining both and having the duality of existing in a hearing world, but also having a hard of hearing world. So there are many different ways that people navigate and draw the line where they're sort of straddling both. And for us to understand that it can be difficult for people to navigate from one culture to the next, because there are a different set of rules for each. So understand that it can be difficult for some people to, go from one world to the next, depending on how immersed they are in that culture. But that's just part of it as well. Also, understand that names are a thing in deaf culture that are different than in hearing culture. Our names are names. For example, if someone were to say, "Hey, Ruth," I'd be like, "Oh, hello." But for some people, depending on their interactions with those people, their names are assigned based on their experience with that person, or with, I think my lights just went out. That is interesting. Oh, okay. My apologies. There we go. I guess we're having a hard time with electricity today. But there are different names that people can have during this time. So for example, I know for a lot of people, they have like red hair. And there are different signs for red hair. Instead of that person having their name, it can be a physical attribute or a story behind that person. So there are a lot of different ways to do that. Here are some other great resources. I just want to put them out there just so that people are aware of them. Things not to say to a deaf person. It is a very good resource, but there were too many swear words for our programming today. So people can check that out in their own time. Also understand that there are a lot of different YouTube channels that talk about deafness and addiction. So these people in particular actually have ASL stories with their deafness. So I thought that was really interesting in a lot of different ways. The nationaldeafcenter.org was where I got a lot of my information. And just looking up the word deafness on YouTube, you can find a whole list of videos and a lot of different ways to interact with that community. So a lot of people ask, what can we do? There are a lot of different things we can do. Understand that accessibility is a huge part of this. Have diverse and interesting stories with many abilities in them. So if we share stories, if we share interactions, understand that there are many different ways that we can do that. There's also something on here, especially for educators. Hereforyou.com is a great resource as well. And it talks about 6 books with strong deaf characters. So if you're looking for something that talks about people who are hard of hearing or who are deaf, having interactions, having strong interactions, being strong characters, that is a great book, a great resource just to look at. Also, look at monitor changes of behavior. So if someone who is hard of hearing or who is identifies as deaf may have changes in their behavior, understand that, reach out to them, see what's up, see what's going on, be gentle, be open to any sort of thing that they may want to talk about or may want to listen to. So be open to listen, be open to understand what their experiences are. And also know that even if you don't know American Sign Language, even if you don't know ASL or SSE, still be open to listen. Find the people that can interact with that person or that youth in particular to make sure that they are getting the resources they need, even if it's not with you, even if you're a supplemental person in that situation or in that scenario, you still need to be a part of the interaction because they trusted you to come to you. Be open to learn something new. There may be a lot of different ways that you interact with someone and you may think you know a lot about it, but there's always room to learn more. And be intentional with your words and actions. So if you're using certain words, understand what the connotations of each word is. And I have a great presentation on how words matter and what that looks like. And I'll put that in the YouTube description below. So understand that there are a lot of different ways that we can be intentional and a lot of different words we can use. And just being active in the way that we talk with one another can really mitigate some of those trauma responses and mitigate anything that can actually hurt that population. I am going to end my presentation with 2 quotes. One, diversity is the mix, inclusion is making the mix work. So making sure that when we are having conversations about how to include others, or diversity is so important, let's make sure that we have able-bodied people. Sure, that's part of the conversation, especially when it comes to, people of color and things like that, but also understanding that ability is a huge part of that as well. And including everyone in that process is a huge part of that diversity. Diversity only exists when we look at the inclusion of others. If we say, oh, we have this many people, this is the quota that we met, that's not the way that people move forward and people feel included. Inclusion, accommodation, those are the things that make the mix work. Also, this is another great quote by the National Inclusion Project. Inclusion is not simply about physical proximity, it's about intentionally planning for the success of all students. And I think that sort of says it all, that we can sort of end on understanding that there are so many different ways that we can do this. There's so many different ways that people can be included. And that if we are just to find the right way, then all of our students, all the youth that we work with can flourish and find goodness and live fulfilling lives later on. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts. I really do appreciate it. So have a wonderful week. Bye.